The chromatic floors of the Galactic Unity complex gleamed under the triple moon light, filtering through the massive observatory dome. Dante Morrison guided his polishing equipment across the iridescent tiles, watching the way they shifted from amber to violet with each pass. His dark brown hair was slightly damp with perspiration, and his gray maintenance uniform clung to his athletic frame, a physique built from years of physical labor rather than gym memberships. Morrison. Supervisor Hendrix's voice crackled through his earpiece. The Zetherian delegation arrives in 30 minutes. Every surface needs to be perfect, understand? These aren't just any aliens, they're the ones who control half the trade routes in this sector. Understood, sir, Dante replied, his hazel eyes scanning for any imperfection. He'd been working at the complex for 3 years now, ever since his life had taken an unexpected turn. Every night, he returned to his modest apartment where Sophie waited, and every morning, he woke up grateful. They had food on the table and a roof over their heads. That was enough, or at least, that's what he told himself. The grand entrance hall began filling with officials and dignitaries, all dressed in their finest formal wear. Dante retreated to the edges, making himself invisible as he'd learned to do. Maintenance workers were like ghosts in these spaces necessary, but unnoticed until the doors opened. She walked in with the kind of grace that seemed to defy gravity itself. Ambassador Velisa Corey stood nearly 6 feet tall, her willowy frame draped in flowing robes of deep crimson and gold. Her skin had the characteristic luminescent quality of the Zetherian people, a soft, pearlescent blue that seemed to glow from within. High cheekbones framed large, expressive eyes that shifted between shades of silver and gold, depending on the light. Her hair, if it could be called that, was actually delicate crystalline strands that chimed softly with her movements, currently styled in an elaborate updo that suggested both elegance and authority. Dante found himself staring, his polishing cloth forgotten in his hand. Velisa Corey was known throughout the sector not just for her diplomatic prowess, but for her notoriously low opinion of humans. She'd been quoted in several press conferences suggesting that Earth's admission to the Galactic Council had been premature. The humans were too emotionally volatile, too primitive in their thinking. Her species had been exploring the stars for millennia before humanity even invented the wheel. The delegation moved through the hall like a royal procession, and Dante resumed his work, angling his body away. Better to avoid any interaction entirely. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. One of the younger Zetherian attendants, distracted by their datapad, bumped into a decorative pillar. The pillar, an expensive imported piece from the Andromedan galleries, began to topple. Without thinking, Dante dropped his equipment and lunged forward, catching the sculpture moments before it would have shattered across the floor, directly in the path of Ambassador Corey. The hall fell silent. Dante found himself on one knee, the heavy sculpture secured in his arms, breathing hard from the sudden exertion. He looked up to find every eye on him, but particularly one pair of silver-gold eyes that studied him with an expression somewhere between surprise and disdain. "How clumsy," Ambassador Corey said in flawless English, though her accent carried the melodic quality of her native tongue. "Though I suppose we should be grateful that human reflexes are occasionally useful for something beyond manual labor." The implied insult hung in the air. Several human officials shifted uncomfortably, while the Zetherian delegation seemed to find the comment amusing. Dante carefully set the sculpture back on its base, then rose to his full height. At 6'1", he was tall for a human, though still shorter than the ambassador. He met her gaze, directly a breach of protocol that caused several gasps. "With respect, Ambassador," he said, and then continued in perfect High Zetherian, the formal dialect used only in their most sacred ceremonies and diplomatic functions. Perhaps if your attendant had been paying attention to their surroundings rather than their technology, the clumsiness could have been avoided entirely. Though I understand that awareness of one's environment is considered a rather primitive trait among humans. The silence that followed was absolute. High Zetherian was notoriously difficult to learn. The language incorporated not just sounds, but subtle harmonic frequencies that human vocal cords could barely produce. It typically took non-Zetherian speakers decades to achieve even basic proficiency. The grammar structure was based on mathematical principles that most species found bewildering. And yet, this human maintenance worker had just spoken it with near-perfect intonation and unmistakable sarcasm. Felisa Corey's expression underwent a rapid transformation shock, confusion, then something that might have been respect before settling on cool interest. Her eyes, which had been a dismissive silver, suddenly swirled with flecks of amaranth. Involuntary reaction among Zetherian that indicated genuine surprise. "You speak the high tongue," she said, also in high Zetherian now, her voice losing some of its cold edge. "This is unexpected." "Life is full of surprises, Ambassador," Dante replied in the same language. "Even for those of us who merely push mops for a living." He could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was rapidly reassessing him. Around them, the delegation members whispered urgently to one another. Humans in the hall looked bewildered. They couldn't understand the exchange, but they could sense its significance. "What is your name?" Felisa asked, still in high Zetherian. "Dante Morrison, Ambassador." He picked up his fallen equipment. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I have floors to finish before your reception begins." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away with unhurried dignity, feeling her gaze boring into his back with every step. His heart hammered in his chest, not just from the confrontation, but from the way her eyes had changed color when she looked at him, the subtle shift in her posture that suggested his words had landed exactly as intended. "Morrison." Hendricks appeared at his elbow, face red. "What the hell was that?" "You don't speak to an ambassador like she spoke to me first," Dante interrupted calmly, switching back to English. "I simply responded in kind. Now, if you'll excuse me, sir, I have 30 minutes to finish this hall." As he worked, he could feel eyes on him, dozens of them. The whispers had already started. By tomorrow, everyone in the complex would know about the maintenance worker who spoke high Zetherian. By next week, the story would spread across the sector. His communicator buzzed. A text from Rebecca, his neighbor who watched Sophie after school. "Your daughter wants to know if you'll help with her astronomy project tonight." Something about mapping binary star systems. Dante smiled, his heart swelling with love for his curious, brilliant little girl. "Tell her yes. I'll be home by 6. Another message appeared, this one from an unknown sender with Zetherian protocols. "Ambassador, Corey requests your presence in conference room 7 at 1800 hours. Attendance is mandatory." Dante stared at the message, his pulse quickening. He'd have to call Rebecca, ask her to keep Sophie for an extra hour. This was either going to be the worst mistake of his life. He didn't let himself finish that thought. Ambassador Felisa Corey despised humans. Whatever she wanted, it certainly wasn't going to be pleasant. But as he returned to his polishing, he couldn't quite suppress the small smile that tugged at his lips. For the first time in 3 years, he'd felt truly seen. Not as a maintenance worker, not as a single father struggling to make ends meet, but as someone worthy of respect. Even if that respect came wrapped in the cold indifference of an alien ambassador who thought his entire species was beneath her. Conference Room 7 was located in the diplomatic wing, a place Dante hadn't set foot in for years. The hallways here were decorated with artifacts from 100 world sculptures that defied physics, paintings that moved and breathed, crystals that hummed with ancient songs. Each piece was a reminder of everything he'd once been part of, and everything he'd lost. He'd changed out of his maintenance uniform into the only decent clothes. He owned a simple black shirt and gray slacks that he kept for parent-teacher conferences. His hands, calloused from years of physical labor, felt empty without his equipment. Exposed out the door to conference room 7 slid open at his approach, revealing a space that was smaller and more intimate than he'd expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city below, now glittering with evening lights. Ambassador Velisa Kaur stood with her back to him, her crystalline hair catching the last rays of sunset and scattering them like tiny rainbows across the walls. She'd changed as well. Gone were the formal robes, replaced by a more casual ensemble, a high-neck tunic of deep sapphire that complemented her luminescent skin, paired with flowing pants that seemed to shimmer when she moved. The effect was striking, elegant without the imposing formality of her earlier attire. "Close the door, please," she said in high Zetherian, still not turning around. Dante did as instructed, very aware that he was now alone with one of the most powerful diplomats in the sector. The door sealed with a soft hiss, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. "You've been researching me," Velisa said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were a swirling mixture of colors: silver, gold, and now hints of violet that he didn't recognize. "Your employment file is remarkably sparse, Mr. Morrison. 3 years at the Galactic Unity Complex Maintenance Division. Before that, nothing. As if you simply materialized into existence. Is there a question in there, Ambassador?" Dante kept his voice neutral, his posture relaxed, despite the tension coiling in his chest. "Several. Actually." She moved toward him with that same otherworldly grace, stopping just close enough to be conversational, but far enough to maintain professional distance. "Who are you? Where did you learn High Zetherian? And why is a man with your obvious education and linguistic gifts pushing a mop through hallways?" Dante met her gaze steadily. "I could ask you similar questions. Why does an ambassador who famously despises humans request a private meeting with a maintenance worker? What do you really want from me?" Something flickered across her face: surprise, perhaps, at being challenged so directly. Among her own people, such insolence would be unthinkable. But instead of anger, her eyes swirled with more of that mysterious violet color. "Fair enough," she said softly, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she smiled. It transformed her face completely, softening the aristocratic features into something warm and genuinely beautiful. "I want to understand you. Today you unsettled me. I don't enjoy being unsettled." "Then I apologize for the inconvenience," Dante said, unable to keep the dry humor from his voice. Velisa laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Don't apologize. It was refreshing, actually. Do you know how many beings in this galaxy tell me exactly what they think I want to hear? How exhausting it is to be surrounded by sycophants and political climbers." "I can imagine," Dante said carefully. "No, you can't." She moved to a small bar in the corner, pouring 2 glasses of an amber liquid that glowed faintly. "You're human. Your species has barely left your home planet. You can't possibly understand the weight of 3,000 years of diplomatic history. The burden of representing a civilization that was ancient when your ancestors were still living in caves." There it was, the casual condescension that her species was famous for. But Dante heard something underneath it, something that sounded almost like loneliness. "You're right," he said, accepting the glass she offered. Their fingers brushed, and he felt a jolt of something electric pass between them. Velisa's eyes flashed with that violet color again. "I can't understand what it's like to be you. Just like you can't understand what it's like to be me. Then enlighten me." She settled into one of the chairs, gesturing for him to do the same. "Who is Dante Morrison?" He sat, taking a sip of the drink. It was sweet and complex, with flavors he couldn't quite identify. "I'm a father. That's the most important thing. Everything else comes second. You have a child." It wasn't a question. She'd obviously done her research, too. A daughter, 7 years old. Sophie. She's the reason I wake up every morning, Dante said simply. The reason I take a job that's beneath my education level, as you so astutely noticed. She's my world. Velisa studied him with those shifting eyes, and he could see her processing this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of humans. And her mother? Gone. The word came out harder than he intended. She died 4 years ago. Medical condition that the doctors couldn't treat in time. The violet in Velisa's eyes deepened, spreading until they were almost entirely that mysterious color. I'm sorry for your loss. Among my people, raising a child alone is considered one of the greatest honors and one of the greatest challenges. It's both, Dante agreed. He found himself relaxing slightly, surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. But Sophie makes it easy. She's brilliant, curious kind. She sees the best in everyone, even in species she's never met before, like Zetherians. Velisa's tone was knowing. She'd probably ask you 10,000 questions about your home world, and want to know if you have any kids she could write letters to. Dante smiled at the thought. She's obsessed with astronomy right now. Wants to map every binary star system in the local cluster. That's quite ambitious for a 7-year-old human. There was approval in Velisa's voice now, and something else, a wistfulness, that caught Dante off guard. Do you have children, Ambassador? No. The word was soft, almost sad. My position doesn't allow for such ... complications. I'm married to my work. As you humans might say. That sounds lonely. Velisa's eyes met his, and the vulnerability in them took his breath away. It is. More than you know. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had expected. Dante found himself noticing details he'd missed before, the way her crystalline hair caught the light, the elegant curve of her neck, the intelligence and sadness in those remarkable eyes. You still haven't told me, Velisa said, breaking the silence, how you learned High Cytherian. Dante set down his glass. I was a diplomatic translator. 8 years ago, before Sophie was born. I was assigned to the Cytherian embassy, learned the language through immersion and formal training. I was good at it, good enough that I was being considered for senior positions. What happened? My wife got sick. The medical bills were astronomical, even with insurance. I took on extra work, started making mistakes from exhaustion. Then she died, and I had a newborn to care for alone. He met Velisa's gaze steadily. I was asked to resign. Translators can't afford to make mistakes in diplomatic settings. So I did what I had to do, found work that let me support Sophie and be present in her life. You sacrificed your career for your daughter. Velisa's voice was filled with something that sounded like awe. That's remarkably noble. It's not noble. It's just being a parent. Among my people, such devotion is considered the highest virtue. Velisa leaned forward, and Dante could smell her scent, something like moonflowers and ozone, alien but intoxicating. You continue to surprise me, Dante Morrison. Is that why you really called me here? To satisfy your curiosity about the surprising human? Partly. Her eyes were fully violet now, a color he was beginning to realize meant something significant. But also because I find myself wanting to apologize. For what? For what I said earlier, about humans being useful only for manual labor. It was cruel and beneath me. She looked down at her hands, and for the first time, Dante saw uncertainty in her posture. I've spent so long believing that humans were inferior, that your species had nothing to offer beyond primitive charm. You forced me to confront that prejudice. Prejudice is comfortable, Dante said quietly. It's much easier to dismiss an entire species than to see them as individuals. Yes, Velisa looked up, and there was genuine remorse in her expression. I'm sorry, Dante, truly. The apology, coming from someone of her stature and species, was extraordinary. Zetherians rarely apologized to anyone, let alone to humans. The fact that she'd done so in private, where no one could see it as political weakness, made it even more meaningful. "Apology accepted," Dante said. "On one condition." Her eyebrows rose. "You're making conditions with an ambassador?" "I'm making conditions with a person who I think might want to be my friend." He smiled at her surprised expression. "Have dinner with me. Not here, not in some formal setting. Come to my apartment. Meet Sophie. See what a real human life looks like, beyond the stereotypes." "That's highly inappropriate," Melissa said. But her eyes were swirling with colors violet, gold, silver, and now flecks of warm amber. "Probably. But you're curious, aren't you? You want to understand humans better, to see beyond the prejudices you've held. What better way than to spend an evening with an actual human family?" Felisa stood and walked to the window, her back to him again. Dante waited, letting her process the invitation. He knew it was forward, perhaps even foolish. She was an ambassador. He was a maintenance worker. The social gap between them was a chasm. But something had shifted during their conversation, something that felt important. "Tomorrow evening," Felisa said finally, turning to face him. Her eyes were almost entirely violet now, glowing softly in the dimming light. "What time?" 7. I'll send you the address. I'll be there." She paused, then added in English, her accent making the words sound like music. "Thank you, Dante, for seeing me as more than my title." "Thank you for seeing me as more than my job," he replied, as Dante left the conference room. His heart was racing. He'd just invited one of the most powerful diplomats in the sector to his modest apartment for dinner. It was insane, reckless, and yet it felt right in a way he couldn't explain. His communicator buzzed. "Rebecca, Sophie is making friendship bracelets. She says she wants to make one for Daddy's new alien friend. Kids are psychic, I swear." Dante laughed, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. His daughter, with her innocent wisdom, had somehow sensed what he was only beginning to acknowledge, that Ambassador Felisa, Corey, was becoming something more than a passing encounter. She was becoming someone who mattered. Behind him, still standing in conference room 7, Felisa placed her hand against the window. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes still glowing that unusual violet, the color that, in Zetherian biology, indicated deep emotional connection and the beginning of romantic attraction. "What are you doing, Felisa?" She whispered to herself in her native tongue, but she already knew the answer. For the first time in her long career, she was choosing to follow her heart instead of her duty. And it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Tomorrow, she would step into a world she'd always dismissed as beneath her notice. She would meet a human child and see the life that Dante had built from sacrifice and love. And somehow, she knew that everything was about to change